he actually showed me a mudguard for my Austin 7. That's how small he was. We were both members of the 750 club. You remember, the first Lotus was an Austin 7. And it was so good, the club eventually asked him to stop competing because nobody else could get a look in. And I went there and with an Austin 7 and needed some mudguards, and Colin was there, and he said, yeah, and they rolled them out for £5, I think. That's how small he was. That was under the railway arches. Yes, pardon?
He sold it to himself, did he?
Yeah. Either that or Hazel Williams did, I don't remember now. But they were in a sort of railway arch at Hornsey.
Did you pay with a note, and did you get any change?
I didn't get a receipt, but I got the mudguards.
When do you think he got sort of complex, though, Richard? I mean, because Chapman, the stories one hears of him in his early days, he was a very sort of straightforward, bright, bushy-tailed bloke. But at some stage, obviously, things changed, didn't they?
He was an engineer who turned into a businessman by the looks of things, wasn't he, really? And what strikes me about people of his generation when they were in their prime was how much lateral thinking they could do, how much ingenuity they could bring to the business of designing racing cars. The regulations in those days were a lot looser, and he could use his creativity on that. Maybe it had something to do with the regulations tightening up, which is some of his creativity went into the business side.
I think the scrutineering was a bit looser too.
It probably was, yeah.
Well, the rules were simpler, weren't they? You know, it was like Henry Longhurst's thing about the rules of golf. You know, the rules of golf should always be sufficiently simple to be written on the back of the scorecard. You know, the rules of Formula One used to be like that. Yeah. And when they became more and more prescriptive and more confining, Colin, you know, that wasn't in his nature to be confined in that way. You know, he was trying to burst out of it, and that's what he did, Nigel, with the low stage area.
Absolutely. I mean, I've thought so many times recently this contemporary era of Formula 1 would have driven Colin nuts.
He wouldn't have driven it.
No, because it's so restrictive. I think it would have, his creative talents would have been stifled, and I think he would have got bored with it.
But somebody like Patrick Head is probably as brilliant as Chapman, isn't he? You know, and is capable of that degree of lateral thinking, of trying to bring new things into the cars, but just is incapacitated.
Yes, that's probably right. And Patrick is frustrated to a great degree. I think probably Adrian, you probably, you know.
Well, Gordon Murray was one of the most innovative people you could possibly think of, and Gordon, effectively, I think he was worn down by Formula One, by the calendar pressures of Formula One, and by the pressures of working with it, and running the Brabham team, and all the other things that he was doing.
Drive everybody mad.
Yeah, absolutely. But Gordon was hugely innovative, wasn't he?
Just thinking back to old Chapman there, you know, he's often considered the sort of, or some people consider him to be like the father of modern Grand Prix racing. I personally don't ever see Chapman as being that. I always think of the Coopers as more being sort of the fathers of Grand Prix racing today, because they came up with this bright idea of popping the engine in the back. But whatever Chapman was or wasn't, of course, I mean, he certainly has provided us. Here we are, 14 years after his death. That he's still a subject in motorsport of some magnanimity, isn't he? I mean, we still we're still talking about it.
Even though his team is no longer there.
Yeah. He made his place in history,
but
didn't he?
You can still, you can see the effect of John Cooper's innovations as well, but you can see Chapman's state of mind, even though the engineers can't be quite as inventive. You can see them aspiring to that kind of thing that Chapman had, that sort of sharpness, that fineness of inspiration.
Did he blew his brains out? His brains were blown a bit by everything? I mean, he couldn't handle it after a while.
I would have thought not. No, I mean, his life obviously got very, very, very complicated indeed.
Well, would Chapman have achieved as much as he did if John Cooper hadn't been around?
Well, it was a while before Chapman went rear-engined, wasn't it? Cooper wasn't just putting the engine in the back of the car, it was making a lightweight car, wasn't it?
Sure.
Because people had put the engine there before.
Cooper Bristol at 500.
And it's interesting, Chapman did draw up a very good front-engine Formula One car, had he made it reliable, had it run properly. Yeah.
In those days, you could buy a car or build a car and be competitive at the highest level.
But isn't that one reason why the Brits are so good at this sort of cottage industry, if you wish, of Grand Prix racing? Because it requires you to have a look at a set of rules and regulations, not Germanically up and down particularly, but you've got to have a lateral look at it. Rather like sort of commando raiding. I mean, we're particularly good at that, aren't we?
Yeah.
That's why surely this industry of ours has blossomed, because we're good at seeing an alternative route to solve a problem.
Yeah.
There was a thing there with BRM, you know, when BRM in the late 40s and early 50s started to build the V16 project and all that stuff. The hierarchy there saw themselves as being a British Mercedes-Benz racing team. They weren't the Mercedes-Benz production company, but they were the Mercedes-Benz racing team, transferred into a British sort of context, they thought. And it didn't work. And one of the things, if you know, because I've done quite a lot of rummaging about in BRM records and Lotus records and Cooper records, everything that BRM did was recorded in octuplicate. You know, I mean, there are carbons of everything. It's incredible. You know, the actual bump, the paperwork is huge. It would fill this building. Lotus, the records were kept on the back of an envelope, you know, and at Cooper, there was nobody that could write. You know, that's the way
John
it
Cooper
worked
said
out.
the first one was actually drawn on the garage floor.
It was, yeah. Well, on the wall it was. Yeah.
There was wasn't there some sort of pamphlet? Her Majesty's Stationery Office had a sort of Mercedes-Benz investigation team after the war.
Yeah.
Went in and drew it all up. And I believe that Raymond Mays and Berthon started out with this HMSO booklet, thinking of the V16 BRM.
One of the puzzles about the and they weren't short of money, were they? And yet they still failed.
Well, yeah, it's a bit of a moot point that they weren't short of money. The trust gathered a considerable amount of money, and they spent a lot of money on running themselves. You
Much
know,
less money than John Cooper.
Yeah, but BRM weren't selling anything.
No.
Whereas the little Cooper car company, you know, when they set out in 47, 48, you know, they built a batch of a dozen cars, and they sold 11 of them, you know, and old man Charlie Cooper said, hey, you know, this is great business, look at this, you know.
And the cars
the
were
way
got
they
to
went.
be competitive for a while. I mean, you got a few seasons use out of your tube. That's probably why Grand Prix cars today are only sold as collector's items well after the event, because you don't want last year's car, do you? It's useless.
When Tom Wheatcroft started putting together the Donington collection, his great war cry was that there's now so cheap as last year's Grand Prix car. And it was true then.
That's right. Well, we used to send them off to South America, of course, and all those wonderful Formula Libre races. That's why some of the best collector Grand Prix cars in the world have all come out of Argentina and Brazil, because the Temporada series, whatever, all the junk from Europe got fetched out, didn't it, for the winter?
Produced a couple of good drivers, too.
I should say, absolutely.
To what extent did the early Coopers and the early cars of the 50s, where did they get their money from? The tyre companies? Fuel companies?
Oil companies, mainly.
Because the cars
Yeah.
had no logos on them.
No.
You had bonuses, too.
Divvies, I think they call them.
Basically, if you got a result, any kind of result worth
If you
publicising,
scored.
If you scored, then you got 25 quid for a win, I think, basically. If you were, and they would advertise
And
with
free
Motorsport
fuel,
or whatever.
and free fuel or tyres.
You got free fuel and tires. That wasn't the expense, though, in those days. I mean, it was about 9 pence a gallon or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, but, you know,
Good stuff.
if you were earning 1 and twopence a week, you know, 9 pence a gallon was bad news.
Well, that's true, yeah.
Plus the fact, was it available? You know, the lovely thing, immediately after the war, when HWM started racing, George Abacassis and John Heath, who ran HWM between them, George was a wonderful character, and I remember George telling me that they had a converted bus as their car transporter, you know, with the back cut out of the bus and a ramp put in, and they could get 2 or 3 cars in the bus, and then it would tow this whacking great big double-deck trailer with 2 cars in the trailer. And under the floor of the bus, they had a fuel tank installed that they'd made up themselves. There was about 200-gallon fuel tank, and they would fill it up with fuel. And in those days, when you got your customs carnets and triptychs and so on from the RAC to take all your racing cars and your transporter abroad, you were also given tourist carnets, tourist tickets, a sort of a book of tear-off tickets, so that you could draw fuel, you know, fuel coupons for France. And so they'd fill this thing up at Walton-on-Thames, where their works was, and then they'd drive off to Dover, go across on the ferry, off the other side, and they'd go straight to the La Madeleine in Paris, where there were people, sort of guys in long coats, you know, and snap-brimmed hats with the collars turned up, you know, walking around on the pavement. And George would pitch out of the transporter, and he'd be going around selling off these fuel coupons to these people and drawing francs for it. And then the mechanics would open up the back of the trailer, which only had 1 car in it instead of 2 cars, and one rack would be full of worn-out racing tyres, and all these guys were buying racing tyres like you couldn't believe, because they fit on their 2 CVs and stuff.
Brilliant.
And, you know, there they were, and they drew this great wad of francs. They had enough fuel on board the transporter to go all the way around Europe for 6 weeks and back home.
Well, you've
without
answered
having to
Brian's
refuel.
question, I think. Where did the money come from?
Well, exactly.
When I started racing all those years ago, we would have to wheel and deal in between countries. You know, if you're lucky to get a few free brake pads in Germany, well, you'd cart those off to Italy. You'd swap those for a carburetor or two or something, you know, and then those carburetors are really good things to have in France, so you get a few cars. Somehow you kept going.
Seeing some of the old films, one I've forgotten, the non-existence of safety precautions. I mean, straw bales about every 6 feet was about the maximum protection you could get. I mean, what was Armco?
Didn't exist, did it?
Well, I think for the drivers and also for the spectators.
Yeah, spectators were, you know, they were in the firing line.
Oh, Silverstone had a chestnut paling fence all along Hanger Street.
I remember the first time I went to the Targa Florio, I went down with Vic Elford, and he said, well, you'll never learn the circuit, he said, but you know where the hairy bits are, because you can see the crowds on the apex of the falls and the jumps.
Yeah, they're all standing in front of the bend sign, you know, because they want
waiting for a happening.
You remember Paul Hawkins?
Very much so, yeah.
Paul was wonderful, you know, he was the son of an Australian preacher, an Australian clergyman. He had a voice like a delivery of gravel.
Gravel, yes, that's right.
And a
face to
a
match.
face that was heavily
Yes.
pockmarked, like,
Yes.
like the wrong side of the moon.
Shrapnel tester.
And he would drive anything, anywhere, and he
Yeah.
loved the Targa Florio, and I think it was with Brian Redman, who was very concerned about the Targa, you know, because Brian crashed a Porsche there and burned his face. You know,
Yeah,
because
still
it
got
took
the marks,
it,
doesn't
yeah,
it?
it took ages for anybody to get any help for him. But Brian was concerned, I think if it was Brian, whoever it was, the other driver was concerned about the Targa and said to, you know, 44.5 miles round the mountains per lap and 10 laps. And he said to Paul, but Paul, you know, when you're driving the Targa, he said, there are points where there's nowhere to go. He said, there are people everywhere, and you've got to choose between people and a stone wall. And Paul said, nah, mate, he said, if I had to choose between people and a stone wall, he said, I'd choose people every time. People are mushy. well, that's a real road racer.
I didn't know Paul was a Cockney.
I do with that.
Yeah. I always think of Grand Prix racing as it's a bit like walking into a chemist shop, buying a packet of razor blades, and going home to sharpen them. I mean, what on earth do you do next? And when Gordon Murray, who I have had
Touch your wrists.
well, I've had a great friendship with Gordon Murray ever since I first met him in the drawing office at Brabham's, and he used to come back and he'd been looking at, say, a Brabham that had had an accident, and he'd be wondering how he could par off a quarter of an ounce from this upright, or that doesn't seem to have sheared quite as well as it should have done. So he'll, you know, it's most minuscule things, of course, which is sharpening razor blades.
Owen the Beard at Cooper's told me a lovely story about John Cooper, saying who said to his father, Dad, we've got to start, you know, doing proper stress calculations on our chassis. And old Charlie Cooper, who was nobody's mug, said, nah, boy, you don't do that. He said, that Colin Chapman does that, and they spend every night after they've run them welding them, which was true.
There's a little-known story about the early Coopers that John Cooper told me that apparently Norton's wouldn't sell them the engines. They had to buy the complete Grand Prix motorbike.
They had to buy the Grand Prix bikes and throw the frame away.
And then flog the frames to the oily boys who put Triumph engines in them and produced a bike called the Triton.
There was
Is that
another.
how that came
Yes,
about?
yes.
A mate of mine.
Because
had a
these
Triton.
featherbed Norton frames were being sold off cheap.